Robert Pugh and welcome to my studio. Today we are going to get you out of that fully auto mode or that aperture priority mode. I'm going to get you using manual mode of your camera. So maybe you've gone out and you've bought yourself a new lens and it's a manual lens like this one I'm using on my camera today. So this is the Lensbaby Velvet 28mm. So this lens has an effect built into it. So if I take a picture, I can see the effect straight away on the back of my screen, or if I transfer that image to my phone or my computer, I can see the effect instantly there. But to get the best out of this lens or your camera, we really do need to understand the manual mode and how it works. Or maybe you just want to improve your photography and your creative skills. So we definitely need to understand the manual mode of the camera. Now, I'm going to be using the exposure triangle because I think it's really important that you understand how we get to the point of a correct exposure. And to make it as simple as possible, I've decided to break this down into a series of modules. So let's just throw up now the modules that we'll be covering today. So if you want to follow me along, if you want to get your camera, get a pen and a notepad as well, and let's get started with that first module. So a DSLR versus a mirrorless camera, what is the difference? And does it really make any difference in sort of today's technology and how it's evolving? Well, let me explain a little bit about both of them. Today, if you went to manufacturers' websites, and I would say along the lines of Canon and Nikon, when it came to Sony, so Sony actually doesn't make any DSLRs, they never have done. If you go to the closest one of a DSLR, it's their A99, and that has what we know known as a translucent mirror. So that was a mirror that was see-through, and that was probably their first iteration at a mirrorless camera. And from there it evolved over time to come to what we have today, and that is a full-on mirrorless camera. But I'll talk more about the features in a minute. So a DSLR, sort of like a Canon or a Nikon, those are big and they're bulky. And they're big and bulky for a reason. Now, it isn't due to its ergonomics of where the buttons are placed. That isn't an issue. The buttons are the same on a mirrorless. But what it is, it needs depth in the camera because of how the shutter works. And this is why a mirrorless camera, I'm going to show you just here, this is how thin. I mean, my mirrorless camera is no thicker than actually my camera strap. A DSLR is a lot thicker because of the depth it needs, because it has a sensor which is here, and then in front of the sensor it will then have the mechanical shutter which is here, and then in front of that it will have the mirror that will lift up and lift down. So the disadvantages of a DSLR is, say you're looking through the viewfinder. So the viewfinder, obviously this is on the top, the bump here. Now on a DSLR, this bump, it has what we know as a prism inside. And this prism, it's like a pyramid of glass that light comes through the lens, it hits the mirror, and the mirror is kind of, it's angled at a wedge. It hits the mirror, it comes up through the prism and out, and that way we can actually see through the lens to take our meter reading, to align the image we want to do and see the subject, and then we take the picture. But when we hit that shutter button, what happens is the mirror has to lift up. But when it lifts up to reveal the shutter, which will then come down to expose the sensor, so then the light comes through, it hits the sensor records the image, and then the shutter comes back up, and then the mirror will drop back down. But every time that mirror lifts up, it blocks the light that goes up into the prism, so we can no longer see the image. Okay, so if you're doing a burst, say you're a sports photographer and you've got this bike coming past, and all of a sudden you do that burst, and then the mirror will lift up and the shutter will go, and as long as that mirror is lifted up, you can no longer see the subject through the prism. So that's the disadvantages of obviously the DSLR. The advantages of a mirrorless camera is because they don't need the depth there, they are a lot lighter, they're a lot smaller, and on the top there isn't a prism. So on the top here, it's actually, the best way to describe it is a TV screen. So it's exactly the same as one of these OLED panels on the back, but on the top it's just an OLED panel. It's a very small TV screen, and because of that we don't need to have that mirror that lifts up, so it eliminates that. So if we take that out of the equation, we're only left with a sensor and a shutter. So that means that the depth of the camera can actually be thinner and smaller. Now there's also another couple of advantages. So a mirrorless camera actually has two types of shutter. It actually has what's known as a mechanical shutter, and it also has what is known as an electronic shutter. So let me show you and talk you through that. So I wouldn't recommend doing this yourself. I'm going to take the lens off and fire the camera without the lens, but this is going to allow dust into the camera and it'll settle on the sensor. So afterwards I will clean this sensor. So let me just take this off. So here I'm going to just cover this over my face so you can see it. You can see the sensors in there. So this is a full frame camera. I'm using the Sony A9 Mark II. So if I turn this on, now if I press this shutter button, now you can hear a shutter, but this is actually in its electronic shutter mode. So that's a simulation noise of an actual shutter. Okay, so you can actually turn that off. Now the mass advantages of a mirrorless camera is because we have this electronic shutter, we can disable that sound, we can just turn that sound off, and it is completely 100% silent. So for wedding photographers, if you're in a church and you need that, you know, quiet camera, then you put it into electronic shutter and it is, well, there's just no noise at all and you can take your pictures away. Now the disadvantages of the electronic shutter is it can let in some banding due to different hertz of lights. So you need to make sure that you set the camera up properly to allow the hertz to match the different lights. When it's a tungsten light, it affects and you can see banding appear. But if you're outside on normal sort of lighting, then you can shoot all day long in electronic shutter. But most photographers, they tend to prefer to use the mechanical shutter, and I can just turn that on just with a simple press of the button. So let's just turn on mechanical. Okay, so now it's in mechanical mode, so let's show you how that works. And there you have it. So you could hear that the noise, the sound of the shutter was completely different. It was a lot louder, and you could actually see the shutter coming down and coming up. So the shutter was coming down, it was letting the light in, recording that image, and then it was coming back up as well. But the disadvantage is, it's like you hear, you know, using the mechanical shutter, it's a lot noisier. Now, also the advantage of using electronic shutter is for wedding photographers, like I say, it's the quietness of it. But for sports photographers, it's the frames per second as well. So an electronic shutter can go up to a much higher frames per second than a mechanical shutter can do. There's also the possibility that mechanical shutters can fail because they are mechanical, they have moving parts. So, every year or 2 years, you would send your camera in to be serviced, and then they would examine this to say if your shutter needed replacing. Nowadays, replacing the shutter can actually cost more than just buying a new camera in some scenarios. But the electronic shutter, there is no moving parts. It's an actual simulated action of a mechanical shutter that the electronic shutter does, but there is no moving parts. So I like to use I'm going to put this on because we don't want too much dust getting in there. I like to use the electronic shutter in everyday scenario, so I'm not using that mechanical shutter, I'm not draining it down. And then if I need to use that mechanical shutter, for instance, if I'm using flash, then I will have to use mechanical shutter. Electronic shutter doesn't work with flash, so you have to use mechanical if you're using flash. If you've got a flash on top of your camera, or if you've got a trigger on top of your camera, then you have to use mechanical shutter. So there you go. We've now sort of differentiated the DSLR from the mirrorless, and I do have to say that a lot of manufacturers, they are discontinuing their DSLR because the world has kind of changed now in photography, and manufacturers now are very much favouring the mirrorless market. So if you're going to pick a camera and you're doing your research, I would probably highly suggest into a mirrorless camera, and that's going to kind of future-proof yourself as well. So that's it for this module. Let's take a look at the next one. ISO. What is ISO? What does it mean? So we're going to talk about the exposure triangle, but like I mentioned, we're splitting this into sections. So this section is about ISO. At the end of all the sections, we'll bring that exposure triangle together so it makes sense on how each part works. So ISO, back in the film days, it was film speed. So you would buy, say, Aperture 100, which was quite a slow film, or you'd buy Aperture 400. So that's what ISO meant back in the film days. But now we're in the digital format. ISO is, in the most simplest way I can put it, ISO relates to a clean image. So I'm going to break it down, but to start with, if you was to say have ISO 100, so your base ISO on your camera, most cameras tend to be around about between 100 and 200 is their base ISO. And when you set it to this, it means that you're going to have the cleanest look on your image. There's going to be no grain in it, no noise in it. So think of ISO as grain and noise, because that's what it kind of generates. Now, if you go up to the higher end of ISO, say let's say ISO 3200 or ISO 6400, well then your image is going to look a bit more grainier. There's going to be a bit more noise in there. So now you're probably thinking, well, why change the ISO? Let's just leave it at ISO 200. And in an ideal world, that would be brilliant. So this is how I'll probably break it down. The higher the number allows in more light. The lower the number allows in less light. So if it's a really sunny day and there's loads of light around, well then we'll be setting the camera at ISO 100 because there's loads of lighting. The shutter opens up, you take the image, the light comes in. But now think about it as we're in a church, we're doing a wedding. The churches, most churches are very dimly lit. So if we set our camera to ISO 100, then there's not going to be that much light to bring into the camera. So now this is where we need to raise that ISO up to say ISO 3200, and that will make the sensor more sensitive to light. It will allow more light to come in to record that data. I mean, it doesn't physically let more light into the camera because the same amount of light is coming through that lens no matter if you're at 100 or whether you're at 3200. But what it does do is the sensor becomes more sensitive to the light that's coming in. So another way of thinking it is at ISO 100, so daylight, lots of light around you, that smooth, crisp photo. And then you might go night, which is low light, then that's going to be a possibility of more noise, more grain coming in. It depends how you like to shoot. Now, everyone has limits. For myself, I know that I can operate between ISO 100 and ISO 6400, and those pictures that are taken are absolutely fine. They're easily deliverable to clients, even at 6400, and that is on sort of today's technology, sort of these modern cameras. I mean, if we're going backwards to older cameras, I mean, some cameras you can shoot at ISO 800 and you can see grain in there. For instance, a micro 4/3 camera, so that has a smaller sensor. This is a full frame, so it's got a larger sensor, so more light comes in. If it's a smaller sensor, then less light comes in. So if we was then to set our ISO at 800 on a micro 4/3, you would actually start to see grain come into the image. And you might say at 3200 ISO that's the max that you want to shoot at, because you can see that there's grain all around the image. As where at 3200 ISO on a full frame camera, because it lets in more light, then you might not be able to see as much grain. So you know, with a full frame camera, you could actually shoot at ISO 6400 before you start to notice all of that grain coming in. So as a recap, if it's daylight outside, then you're going to be shooting around about ISO 100 to 200. If it's an overcast day, it's quite dull outside, if you can't see the sun, then you're going to be shooting around about ISO 400. If it's dusk, then you may be shooting at ISO 800. And if you're in a low lit area, for instance a church or an event at a venue, you're going to be probably shooting around about ISO 3200. So those are not exact numbers, those are just guesstimates on my style of shooting and how I've been shooting over the years. So that's it for our ISO section. So let's have a look at the next module. Aperture, one of my favourite topics, and f-stops as it's more commonly known. So an aperture are the blades that's located inside the lens, and they open and close to make an iris. But we'll explain how it works and how the numbers work as well. So most camera lenses will have an aperture ring on the outside. They don't all have aperture rings, so if they don't, then you use the dial on the front to change your f-stop, okay? And then you will see some numbers coming around, and the numbers can range as low as sort of f1.2, and they can go all the way up to f22. Now, if you do buy a lens and it does start at f2, then it's probably going to be an expensive lens and it's going to have a lot of glass inside. You know, as a budget, sort of around about f2.8 to say f5.6, if it starts around there, then that's going to be a reasonable lens as well. I mean, in the days, you know, a high-end lens would start at f2.8, but the way that sort of lenses have evolved now, apertures can be wider and let more light in, there's more glass in there, and now we can go even as low as f0.95, which is kind of insane when you think about it. So how do we denote apertures? Well, the smaller the f-stop number lets in more light, okay? And the larger the f-stop number, that lets in less light. So for instance, if you were shooting at say f1.4, then that's wide open like this, okay? We always say wide open. If another photographer says to you, oh, I'm shooting wide open, that means he's shooting at the lowest number his aperture will go to. It's a little bit back to front when it comes to photography, because you would think shooting wide open would be a large number, but it denotes to being the smallest aperture number on the actual camera, so f1.4. So f1.4 is wide open and it's letting in all the light, everything's coming through, okay? Now, the advantages to shooting very low is our depth of field. So if we shoot at f1.4, that's wide open, then your subject, your subject would be very sharp. So if you're focusing on the eye, so the eyes would be really sharp. But what you'd notice is round about here, literally in front of the ears, going back, it would start to go out of focus. What I call it this bokeh-licious, where it all starts to go out of focus and it's lovely and creamy, and we get all these the bokeh going on the background. And a lot of amateur photographers, that's their goal. The goal is to learn how to get this lovely out of focus background, the subject being really sharp and in focus. And that's the key. It's using the aperture and it's shooting wide open. So that's f1.4 wide open, and your subject will be sharp, but the background will be lovely and creamy out of focus. Okay, so maybe that you actually are shooting two people standing side by side. f1.4, not going to quite work. Maybe they're standing a little bit back from the first person. So now you need to open up that depth of field. You need more to be sharper in. So this is when you might go to f4, okay? So you're changing your aperture for f1.4. And what it's doing, the aperture, it'll start to close. And it lets in less light, but it will open up the depth of field and it'll be a much sharper image as it comes back. So two people will now be in focus. So if it's f1.4, one person in focus. If the other person is standing slightly behind them, they will be out of focus. At f4, those two people will be in focus. So let's take it a step further. So let's say there's one person stood in front of you, another person slightly behind, and then there's a tree that's, just behind them. So that tree is out of focus at f4. But if you, close that aperture down, so you're going higher up the number, you're going to go to f8, which is closing it down, then that's letting less light in, but it's giving you a better depth of field. More is in focus. So now that tree back there in the distance, that now is in focus. And maybe you're doing landscapes and you want all those mountains in focus. So most people would shoot around about f16, okay? So then it'd be all lovely and sharp, but that iris has really closed down, so there's a little tiny pinprick what light's coming through. I'm going to show you exactly how that works in a moment. So remember, the brighter the image, the shallower the depth of field. The darker the image, the deeper the depth of field. So the more is in focus, the deeper it is. So I'm going to show you how the aperture works, and we'll use this lens here. This is the Lensbaby Velvet 28mm. I'm just going to close this right down so it's actually at f2.5. Okay, let's just let the camera focus on the lens, and you can see there the aperture right in the center. It's wide open and we're at the lowest aperture at f2.5. Now I'm going to open it up and you can see it. The iris slowly closing, and now I'm at f16. So this is how the terminology works. So now I'm wide open at f2.5, and now I'm going to close this aperture down. So I'm going to slowly turn the aperture and we can see it. Now it's closed right down and I'm now at f16 and it's a little tiny pinprick. Before I show you on another lens, let's look at it this way. Write something on a card. Go and place it at the other end of the room. Now if we sit here and we're just looking at it, we probably can't see what that writing says on the actual paper that you just put on the other side of the room. So we will then close our eyes and we squint. We will squint to see what it is. That's us closing our aperture down. On a sunny day when we're outside, so if we're in the shade, our eyes are open, so our eyes are letting in all the light. But the moment we step into the sun, we then squint. So our eyes are protecting the lenses by squinting and reducing the amount of light that's coming in. We also put sunglasses on, but that's ND filters when it comes to the camera. So let's show you on one more lens. So this is an optic from Lensbaby as well. This is their Twist 60, but it's a brilliant way of showing you their aperture blades. So I'm going to put this right up to the front. Okay, so now we are wide open at f2.5, and I'm going to close this down and you'll see the blades coming in. And there you go. Now I'm at f16 and it's a little tiny pinprick that's letting light through. And let's open it back up. And there you go. That is how an aperture works on a camera. Shutter speed. How do we start and where do we start to explain it? Well, think of shutter as speed. Think of it as slow or fast. Now, we've already talked about how a sensor works and a shutter works with your sensor, and then you have a shutter and the shutter comes up and down. If you have a DSLR, then the mirror comes up and then the shutter comes up and down to reveal the sensor and let the light through. So when it comes to a shutter, think of it about the smaller the shutter speed, okay, the slower it's going to move in front of the sensor up and down. And the slower it moves, the more light it will let in onto the sensor. So the larger the shutter speed number, the faster it's going to move up and down in front of the sensor, and that lets in less light to the actual sensor. So there's pros and cons to both scenarios, but I'll try and explain the best scenarios to use them. So we're going to think about this as slow and fast. So slow, a brighter image, fast is a darker image. Now let's just say you was just, you're photographing your children, or you're doing a portrait. So you don't really need that really fast image, but you don't really want slow image. There's a terminology we use as dragging the shutter, and this is where we actually can make blurry images, and that's more of a creative style, okay? But we want a sharp image. So everything is denoted on seconds, okay? It's always 1/25th of a second or 2/50th of a second. You'll always see a 1 and then a slash, and then it might be 125 or 1/25th of a second. You can also take it all the way down to a second exposure if you want, And then beyond a second exposure, there's a menu that comes up and it's called a bulb mode. So a bulb mode is when you press the shutter, it will open up and it stays open until you actually press the shutter again to close it. So that could keep the shutter open for long periods of time for you to do really long exposures. And this is where you get that really sort of dreamy water when you've done a really long exposure. Now, most people who use that, they're landscape photographers. So they use obviously slower shutters to bring in that moving cloud, you know, that smooth cloud to smooth it out, because normally that mountain's not moving anywhere, but the sky is or the water is. So they use long shutter speeds to get all of that motion kind of blurry and creamy. But a sports photographer would want to use higher shutter speeds because he wants to freeze the action. So to freeze the action, we might be going up to 500th of a second or 1,000th of a second. And what this would do, this would actually freeze the motion. Now there is a middle ground, sort of a portrait photographer would tend to be using 1/25th or 2/50th of a second. And that, it's enough to freeze the motion, but you can actually still get movement in there as well. Now, there is another point to throw across. If you're using flash, now I'm not talking about flash on top of the camera, because when we put one on top of the camera, we can use something that's called high-speed sync. Now, I'm not going to get into that too much, but high-speed sync is when the flash can go off at shutter speeds at 800th of a second or even 1,000th of a second. But most flashes have a sync speed, and a camera has a sync speed as well. So if you was to put a trigger on top of the camera, then you always set the camera at its sync speed. That is generally 2/50th of a second. So most cameras are all around about the 2/50th of a second, but check your manual to see what your camera's sync speed is. It is important to know, because if you do start using flash and you put a trigger on your camera, you will need to put your camera at 2/50th of a second. If you go over your sync speed, what you will start to see is black lines appear on your images, and this is where the shutter hasn't had time to go all the way down and the flash has gone off, and it's actually caught the shutter in midway down. Okay, so let's just have a little look at the shutter speed. I'm going to turn my camera on and I'm going to put myself into mechanical, and we're going to go all the way down to so this is 1/8 of a second. Okay, so let me just go here and go, and you can tell by the sound coming on and off and the shutter speed, that's a slow shutter. So let's now move this, let's go all the way to 2/50th, and we're going to, now we can tell that the shutter's going a lot faster. So now we're going to start freezing motion as well. So if there's that car going past, we'll be able to freeze the motion. If there's that person walking along, we can take a picture of them and they'll be perfectly in focus. They'll be sharp. But if we was to shoot at 30th of a second, that person would actually still be blurry. Even though we focused on them, because they're moving, it would cause motion blur. So let's go now up to 1,000th of a second, and you will see this in action. So that's a lot faster. Now this camera can go up to 8,000th of a second, so you know, really fast and good for sports photographers where you've got the athletes are running along and you want to freeze them. So when it comes to understanding the different scenarios, is very much down to what type of photography you're going to do on that chosen day. Are you out to do a sports event? Well, in that case, you're going to think about these higher shutter numbers. You know, at 250th up to 1,000th, even up to 8,000th of a second, depending on how bright it is outside and how much you want to freeze that action that's coming in front of you. How fast is that action? For instance, a motorbike race with that bike doing 100 mile an hour. Well, to freeze that, you're probably going to be way up there in the 1,000th of a second to freeze that. But you could be in a different scenario where it's night, you know, you've got subjects there, but you want that motion blur to come into effect. Motion blur is when a person they're in focus, but you see a haze around them as they're moving, or the lights are streaky. Well, to do that, you need to be at the lower numbers to do that. And don't forget, if we're shooting at night, okay, the lower the shutter number, the slower the shutter, the more light it's going to let in, so the brighter the image. In the day, okay, so it's bright outside, so the faster the shutter number, then the darker the image will be, the less light that it lets in. So again, you can actually start to see this map unfold of the ISO, the aperture, and the shutter speed. They all do the same thing. They all let in light. And that is all what a camera does. A camera lets in light. It's us as people, as artists, it's how we utilize that light, it's how we see that light. So remember, a camera doesn't see color, okay? A lot of people do think, a camera sees exactly what we do, but it doesn't. A camera only sees black and white. So it sees the darks and it sees the whites, the brightest part. And a camera always wants to try and balance that out. It wants to try and make 18% grey. So we get onto that later on when we talk about white balance. But that's how a camera basically works. It sees black and white and it tries to even the colours out. That's where we get creative when we talk about doing a correct exposure or doing a wrong exposure, but that's right for the picture that we want. So that's shutter speed, and I hope I've brought you up to speed on that. So we've just covered ISO, aperture and shutter speed. So now it's time for the exposure triangle and to bring all that together. So to help me explain that a bit better, let's put a diagram up on the screen and talk you through it. So now you can see we've got the exposure triangle up on the screen. Now what you will know is that the ISO is at the top of the triangle, and then underneath we've got the shutter speed and the aperture. Now the reason behind that is because generally we would always pick our ISO first, and then our ISO would denote what aperture or shutter speed we're going to pick. So I'm going to tell you a scenario now. Let's just say we're going to take a portrait and it's a sunny day. So we will set our ISO to 200. Now because it's a portrait, the second most important setting will be our aperture. As a portrait photographer, you want to determine the depth of field, whether it's out of focus, it's a dreamy, creamy look behind the subject, or whether it's a really sharp image all the way through. So we'll pick our aperture, and let's just say we go for an f2.8. Now the only thing left for us to do is to pick our shutter speed, and our shutter speed will determine a correct exposure. Now the way that this works is on your camera, living in the center of all three is our correct exposure. All cameras have a meter reading, and the meter will say 0 in the center, and then to the left it'll go -1, -2, -3, and to the right it'll go +1, +2, +3. Now those are stops. there will be smaller lines in the middle of each number, and those are third of a stops. You will see a moving line that fluctuates across the bar. Now the ideal exposure is to get the moving bar to sit on 0. So we've already set our ISO to 200 and we've set our aperture to f2.8. So all that's left to do is to set our shutter speed, and we can move our shutter speed until that line sits on the 0. So let's just say we move our shutter speed to 1/250th of a second, and at 1/250th of a second at f4 at ISO 200 it is reading a correct exposure with the line going along 0. But there may be some scenarios that we need to break this rule of a correct exposure. So let's just say you have a white wall behind your subject. Well, the camera, it sees black and white and it tries to make 18% grey. So when it sees this big white space, if you was to set a correct exposure and it was on 0, you might look through the viewfinder and that white wall may look a bit grey. It may look a bit underexposed. So this is a scenario where we would overexpose the image on purpose to get a correct exposure. So we could move it in third of a stops. So if you don't know, every dial on the camera, it moves in clicks, and each click is a third of a stop. So if we was to move our shutter speed 3 clicks, then this would increase it to be 1 full stop. So that would be overexposing a full stop of light, which when you look through the viewfinder, this would then look like a correct exposure if it had a bright white wall as the main background. Now, this also goes true for if the white wall was a black wall. So if it was a solid black colour, when the camera looked at it at our original settings at 2/50th of a second, it would actually read as being a correct exposure, but looking through the camera viewfinder, it would look very overexposed. So the black wall would look like a grey wall and it would look very overexposed. This is because the camera's meter is trying to make 18% grey. Don't forget, it can only see black and white. So therefore, we need to underexpose this image to bring the blacks back into the image. So to do this, we would then move our shutter speed until we get the needle that runs along the line to sit over the -1. So that way we are underexposing by 1 full stop. But you may not need to underexpose by a full stop. 1 click of the wheel is a third of a stop, and that's all that you may need. Now after time you'll get familiar with the needle that's in the centre, it going left and right to under and overexpose. But those are extreme circumstances. On an average day shooting outside, your goal will be to get the needle that floats along the line into the centre where it says 0. And there you go, that is the exposure triangle. All you've got to remember is all 3 components work together. So if you think of it like this, at the top is your ISO, and you, depending on what you're shooting, you would work in a clockwork or an anti-clockwork rotation. Last example I'll give, so you're a portrait photographer, you look at the top of the triangle, you set your ISO. You would then come round in a clockwork orientation, and then you would set your aperture. Once you've set your aperture, you work around to setting your shutter speed, and your shutter speed will determine the correct meter reading for a correct exposure. In our second scenario, you're a sports photographer. So a sports photographer, you go to the top, you set your ISO. You go anti-clockwork around, because then you would set your shutter speed, because your shutter speed is the most important thing as a sports photographer, because you want to freeze the action. Once you've set your shutter speed, you would then carry on anti-clockwise to your aperture, and then you would set your aperture to determine a correct exposure. I hope that has been simple enough to work out, but if not, you can easily keep coming back to this diagram and have a look. So now we've covered all three steps of the exposure triangle. But I do think it's important to note that there is no wrong or right exposure. Even if you do get the exposure to 0, it doesn't necessarily mean that that's a correct exposure. Now we have these sorts of lens from Lensbaby with all effects built in. There's so many different types of ways we can be creative, and it isn't just in the capability of the camera and the lens, it's what you as a visionary sees as well. You're an artist takes that next step. So maybe it is a wrong exposure, maybe it is overexposed or underexposed, but as long as that's the right exposure for you and what you're trying to accomplish, that's all that matters. For instance, myself, all of my images are in theory overexposed because I have my dial set on the top, my exposure compensation. I actually have that set to overexposed by 1/3 of a stop for every image. The reason I do this is because I shoot in JPEG. I do shoot in RAW and JPEG, but the RAW is purely a backup. I like to shoot in JPEG and I'll edit that JPEG. I like to get things 99% right in camera, from the effects with the lens I'm using to my settings in the camera. And I just feel now in this digital age, the way that digital cameras take the picture, I think digital cameras play it safe, and I think they underexpose ever so slightly. So to get to my style and the images that I like, I found that setting my exposure compensation to always overexposed by 1/3 of a stop, that gets me where I want to be for my vision, for my creativity. White balance. White balance in a camera is kind of that hidden gem of what can really bring out the creative side of you. Now, before we talk about white balance, let's just talk about lenses and how different manufacturer lenses can affect the white balance. So, different manufacturers put different coatings on the front of the lens, and they all use slight different tones and colours with these coatings. So for instance, Sony is quite cool, it's got quite a blue look. Canon is quite a warmish tone, and Lensbaby's got a very neutral tone to it. So all this comes into place. You'll probably find that maybe you use that Sigma lens and you love it because you love the colours that it makes. Or maybe you hear people say, I love this Canon lens because the colours that it reproduces. Well, a lot of that is to do with the glass and the coatings that they use. I love Lensbaby lenses, and that is because I love the colours that they produce. Now, white balance is a big part of this. Yes, we can have the camera on auto white balance. It works absolutely flawlessly, and it'll be right 97% of the time. For instance, if you're outside and it's daylight, it'll get it right. The images look perfect and you're good to go. But the moment you start walking in and out of rooms, let's give a scenario. I'm a wedding photographer, I'm doing the bride preparations. We're in a hotel room, there's the daylight coming through the window, we've got lamps around that are all quite yellowish, and we've got a white dress hanging up with lots of other colours coming around. All of these will affect the white balance. So the camera is going to be shifting its white balance all the time. So when you come to edit those pictures and you've got them all in front of you, you will see a shift in every single picture of its white balance. This will come very true once you put them in the client's gallery and they can see all these images with the different white balances coming along. This is why I use the Kelvin. I set my white balance myself in camera, and that way I can be creative as well. So there's only kind of two scenarios of Kelvin that you need to adhere to. One is daylight and two is tungsten. Now again, let's give you a for instance. You're outside, the sun's high up in the sky, it's summer and there's no real clouds around. Now I would say that's daylight, so that is 5600K. Okay, you might hear the term people say these lights are daylight balanced. Well, if they say that, they mean that it's around about 5600 Kelvin, the white balance that they produce. So if you shoot outside, if you put your camera into 5600 Kelvin, then all of those pictures you take outside, the colour from the white balance will be consistent all the way through. Even if you go into shade and come out, you will still have that lovely warm colour from your white balance at 5600 Kelvin. But if you go into a hotel, if you look at older hotels with the old bulbs, you'll notice that the lights around the hotels are very yellowish. So if you go to 3000 Kelvin, then your camera will be matching the white balance that those lights are giving off. This will mean all the pictures you take will be consistent and have the right colours. Now this will save on colour correcting and doing the white balance picker in editing. I'm a big fan on getting it 99% right in camera. Now let's also think about white balance in a way of being creative. For instance, you might think this scene is quite cool and you want to warm it up. Well then all you would do, let's say we're working inside and we're at 3000 Kelvin. So maybe I want to go to 3200 Kelvin, or maybe I want to go to 4000 Kelvin, and I can be creative using the white balance. So with the lens, with my white balance, with my exposure triangle, we can actually be very creative all in manual mode. Setting up your camera to use manual lenses. How do we do it and why do we do it? And also some little extras to help you get the perfect focus when using manual lens. Let's face it, my eyes aren't perfect, my hands aren't steady as well, so if I can implement some extra steps to help me nail in that focus, I'm going to welcome that on. So let's have a look at that now. So to start with manual lenses, and I'll show you with this, let's just take it off. You will notice that there is no connectors around here. It's just a straight fit onto the camera. So we can see we've got contacts on the inside. So when you have an autofocus lens, when you put it on, then the contacts meet and the camera basically knows that our lens is attached and it knows all that information's coming through. But with a manual lens, a total manual lens, there is no connections there. Now, there will be a couple of things that happen when you put a manual lens on. First, you'll turn on your camera. Now, some cameras, they won't work. You'll turn them on and you won't be able to see through the lens. You'll take the cap off and you still won't be able to see through it. That's because you need to enable a function that allows you to shoot manual lenses, and this is called release without a lens. Now The terminology will change from camera to camera. On a Sony, I can tell you where it is, so I'll just press my menu button, and it's on menu 2 and it's on submenu 5, and it's called release W/O lens. So that's release without a lens. You need to enable that function. Now basically what that will do now is the shutter will fire without a lens. So you see it's firing now. If I take this lens off, and it will fire without a lens. Now the majority of manufacturers will have that disabled, so the best way to test it is don't have any lens on, and if you can take a picture, if the shutter opens and closes, then it's already enabled, so you can just put your lens on. But if it doesn't fire and you can't take a picture, you'll need to just refer to your instruction manuals to find out where that is in your cameras menu, and then just enable that. Once it's enabled, you're all good to go. There may be another thing that you will see. So this has an aperture ring around it, meaning, and the majority of manual lenses will all have the aperture ring on their lens. It's very rare that they don't, because there's no contacts on the lens to tell the camera what aperture it's in. So you will notice, and I'm going to show you just here, let the camera focus, you will notice that the f-stop says F, and then it has two little slashes, so there's no number. And that's because there's no contacts. This lens can't tell the camera what f-stop it is. We're doing it manually by turning the aperture ring. So that will always flash. You won't be able to stop that. Now the next thing we can do is, say we're taking a picture. I know with manual lenses it's very hard to know if it's in focus. You can take the picture, press play, zoom into it and check it. But we can also enable peaking. So if we enable peaking, what peaking is, it puts, depending what colour you select, because you could select white, red or yellow. I have mine set to yellow, so anything that's in focus, when I look through the viewfinder, I will see this yellow haze appear around anything that's in focus. And when I move my focus ring, I will see the yellow haze move with the focus ring around anything that is in focus. So it has a yellow haze around it, it's in focus. So that's the first step that I can do to get better focus. And then the second step, the final step, I can actually turn on magnifier. So the focus magnifier is a function you can turn on. And basically, with some manual lenses, as soon as you turn the focus ring, it engages. But with others, you have to manually select it. So I have set mine, because you can change the function of all your buttons, I've assigned mine to a button. So my focus magnifier is assigned to the back here. If I press this, it will zoom in to the image that I'm taking a picture of. Then when I focus, I will get the peaking enabled, which will put the yellow highlights all around the subject. And because I'm zoomed in, I can really fine tune that focus. Then once I've fine tuned my focus, I disengage the focus magnifier, which takes me back to the normal picture, and then I press the shutter button, and there we go, we've got the perfect shot. So let's pop my camera on a tripod, and we'll put it in front of the camera, and let me show you how that actually works so you can see it in real time. So now you can see that yellow haze around. Let's move it out of focus and it disappears. Let's move it over the bookcase, and you can see the bookcase has got a yellow haze around it. That is the peaking. I'm going to tap this button, zoom into the bookcase, and then we can fine tune. And you can see that yellow haze. Again, it's slowly coming around the bookcase, and there we can go even closer if we wanted to and fine tune it. And then so there you go, we've now covered all the steps needed to set your camera up to shoot without a lens, to use focus magnifier, and to also turn on peaking as well. All these functions will help you to create a better image using manual mode on your camera, and to also make you a better photographer as well. So we covered an awful lot in these modules. I hope you've been following me along, and I hope now you've mastered that manual mode and you've got all your settings dialed in to use a manual lens like this Lensbaby lens. I've actually changed my lens now, so I've actually got the Burnside 35mm on. Beautiful lens, and the effect that this creates is the vignette around that you normally would add on in your chosen editing platform. Well, I can actually do that in camera so it appears straight on the image. Check out Lensbaby, check out their range of lenses, and again, I hope this has got you well on the way to using manual mode. Thanks for watching.